Imagine the entire economy of a country as, well, a single student. Forget the complex charts, the confusing headlines for a second. All you're left with is its quarterly report card and the grade on that card. That's gross domestic product, or GDP.
Right.
This one figure, it's the go-to measure, isn't it? The headline stat that's supposed to tell us how well the economy's performing.
Supposed to, yeah. But like any report card, just seeing the grade, well, it doesn't really tell you the whole story.
Exactly. Understanding what actually goes into that number, who uses it, and why there are so many different opinions, often conflicting ones, about what it truly signifies. It's absolutely essential if you want to look past the headlines.
Yeah, it's the single most powerful number cited in pretty much every economic discussion, isn't it? From like kitchen table chats to Federal Reserve meetings. Yet when you actually start digging into it, you realize it's an incredibly blunt instrument. It gives us a picture, sure, but it's a picture with huge blind spots and some surprising distortions, too.
And that's precisely why we're dedicating this deep dive to peeling back the layers of GDP. We've gone through that stack of sources you shared, covers everything from the nuts and bolts to the definition, how it's calculated, to its history, the many different ways it gets reported, who relies on this data, its significant limitations, which honestly might be even more important than its uses. And we're even taking a focused look into one of the most contentious debates around it, the actual impact of government spending on economic growth.
Our mission today really is to go beyond just that surface number. We want to help you unpack this vital economic indicator, understand all its different facets, appreciate its power, sure, but also its profound weaknesses.
Yeah.
And ultimately equip you, the listener, to read the economy's report card with a much more critical and, well-informed eye. It's time to look under the hood, so to speak.
Okay, let's jump right in then. At its core, what is gross domestic product?
Yeah.
Our sources present it as like the comprehensive scorecard for a country's economic health.
Yeah, scorecard's a good way to put it.
And the most common definition you hear is it represents the final market value of all the products and services produced. And this is key. Within a country's physical borders over a specific period, usually quarterly, then edited annually.
Exactly. Think of it like measuring the total economic output generated inside the geographic factory walls of a nation. It almost didn't matter who owns the factory or who the workers are.
Oh, okay.
If the production happens within those borders, it counts towards that country's GDP.
Got it. And how is this huge number actually calculated here in the U.S.?
Well, the U.S. primarily uses what's called the expenditure approach.
The expenditure approach.
Yeah, this basically breaks down the total spending in the economy. It sums up what different key groups are spending. It's often, I think, the most intuitive way for people to grasp GDP because it kind of mirrors how we think about transactions happening all around us every day.
Right, spending makes sense.
That's right. The basic formula, you often see it simplified as GDP equals consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports, C plus I plus G plus NX.
Okay.
Each of those components represents a major slice of the economy's overall activity.
Let's break those down then, because the size and, the fluctuations of these pieces really tell their own story about the economy, don't they?
They absolutely do.
So first, C for consumer spending. Now, in the U.S., this isn't just a component. It's huge, right? It's like the engine room.
Oh, absolutely. It's the largest portion of GDP by far.
And this includes pretty much everything households buy. Groceries, clothes.
Yeah, perishable goods like groceries, non-durable goods like clothing, but also the big stuff, durable goods like cars, appliances, and then all the services, healthcare, education, haircuts, streaming subscriptions, travel, you name it.
Wow, okay. So understanding consumer spending is critical because it's so tied to confidence, isn't it?
Exactly. Our sources really highlight that. When consumer confidence is high, people feel secure, right? About their jobs, their future, and they're just more willing to spend, especially on those bigger ticket items.
Which boosts the economy.
Right. That spending injects demand, encourages businesses to produce more, hire more. But conversely, when confidence dips, maybe because of job market worries or just general economic uncertainty, people tend to pull back. They save more, spend less.
And that slows things down.
Yeah, it can act as a significant drag on economic growth. It's a very direct reflection of the collective mood, of the nation's households.
Okay, next up, IBORF, for total investments. Now, you mentioned this isn't like my personal stock portfolio.
No, definitely not. In the GDP context, investment, the I refers to business investment in capital goods.
Capital goods. like machinery, factories.
Exactly. The machinery, equipment, factories that businesses need to produce things. It also includes residential construction, building new homes.
Oh, okay.
And also changes in business inventories. That's basically the value of goods businesses have produced but haven't sold yet.
Inventories. That sounds like it could signal things.
Oh, it does. This I component is actually pretty volatile. It's often seen as a kind of bellwether for future economic activity.
How so?
Well, when businesses are feeling confident about future demand, they invest, right? They buy new equipment, expand capacity. When construction companies are building lots of new homes, it signals optimism about housing.
Gotcha.
And big swings in inventories, up or down, can signal shifts in demand or maybe what businesses expect production-wise. So this component really reflects business confidence and the economy's capacity for future growth.
Okay, makes sense. Then there's G for government spending. What falls under this?
So G covers both what the government consumes directly, like paying salaries for public employees, buying office supplies, maintaining parks, and also government gross investment. That's the spending on big infrastructure projects, building roads, bridges, schools, or investing in things like military equipment.
And this can play a role when other parts of the economy are weak.
Yeah, it can play a kind of counter-cyclical role. Our sources mention that while it's always a consistent part of GDP, it can become relatively more important when, say, consumer and business spending really decline, like during or after a recession. At those times, government stimulus programs or infrastructure projects can inject much-needed demand and employment into the economy, trying to cushion the downturn or kickstart a recovery.
Okay. And finally, NX for net exports.
Right, net exports. This is simply the value of a country's total exports minus the value of its total imports.
Exports add, imports subtract.
Pretty much. Exports are goods and services made here and sold abroad. They add to our domestic production. Imports are things made abroad that we buy here.
So if we export more than we import,
that's a trade surplus, and net exports add to GDP. If we import more than we export, which the U.S. typically does, that's a trade deficit, and net exports subtract from the GDP calculation.
Okay.
And it's important to remember this is about the value of the actual goods and services crossing the border. It's not necessarily tracking the money flows back and forth directly. That's a different measure, the balance of payments.
Got it. So that's the expenditure approach. C plus I plus G plus NX. Add up all that spending, and you get a picture of the total value produced. Now, who actually crunches these massive numbers in the U.S.?
That huge task falls to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the BEA.
BEA, okay. Part of the Commerce Department.
Yep, exactly. They're the official scorekeepers for the U.S. economy.
And they put these numbers out quarterly and annually.
That's right. They release estimates throughout the quarter. They call them advanced, second, and third estimates. Then the final annual figures come later. These releases are major economic events. Everyone watches them.
And it's not like they just guess, right? The process sounds incredibly complex.
Oh, far from it. They base their estimates on just a vast amount of raw data.
Like what?
Well, direct surveys of businesses and households that the BEA conducts itself, price estimates from all sorts of sources, and then just mountains of information gathered by other government agencies. Think data from the Census Bureau on retail sales, manufacturing, data from the Federal Reserve on banking and finance, info from the Treasury on government finances, data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics on jobs and wages.
Wow.
They're basically aggregating data from across the entire economy. It's a monumental task.
It really makes you appreciate the sheer scale of data collection constantly happening behind the scenes just to get these headline figures.
Absolutely.
Okay, so once the BEA calculates this overall number, our sources stress that it can be reported and talked about in several different ways. Each way highlights a different aspect of the economy's performance, and understanding the terminology here seems crucial.
Absolutely essential. And the first key distinction to get your head around is nominal GDP versus real GDP.
Okay, let's start with nominal. This one measures economic production using current market prices. Seems simple enough.
It does seem simple, but there's a really crucial catch.
Which is?
Inflation. Nominal GDP doesn't strip out the effect of rising prices, so think about it. If the actual quantity of goods and services produced stays exactly the same, but all their prices go up, nominal GDP will still increase.
Making it look like the economy grew.
Exactly, even if no additional real output was created, just things got more expensive.
That sounds like it could be really misleading. Our sources had a pretty clear example, right?
Yeah, a good hypothetical. Imagine a country, its nominal GDP was, say, $100 billion back in 2014 time.
Okay.
10 years later, 2024, it's $150 billion. Now, on the surface, that looks like 50% growth, right? 150B minus $100 divided by $100.
Yeah, sounds good. 50% growth.
But now, hold on. What if prices also rose significantly over that decade? Let's say cumulative inflation meant prices doubled, increased by 100% between 2014 and 2024.
Doubled. Okay.
Then that $150 billion in 2024 actually represents less purchasing power, less real output than the $100 billion did back in 2014.
How do you figure that out?
You'd adjust for the inflation. To find the real GDP in 2014 dollars, you divide the 2024 nominal GDP, $150, by the price increase factor. If prices doubled, the factor is 2.0. So $150 billion divided by 2.0.
Is $75 billion.
Exactly, $75 billion.
Wow. Okay, so the nominal GDP number showed 50% growth, but after you account for inflation, the real GDP actually shows a decline from $100 billion down to $75 billion. That's a huge difference.
It's a stark contrast, isn't it? And it perfectly demonstrates why real GDP is the number everyone focuses on for understanding actual economic growth. Real GDP is the inflation-adjusted measure.
Right.
It tries to reflect the volume, the quantity of goods and services produced by using prices that are held constant from a specific reference year, a base year.
So this lets you make meaningful comparisons over time. Like, are we really producing more stuff, or is it just that everything costs more?
Precisely. Real GDP answers that critical question.
And how's it calculated technically? Nominal divided by?
Yeah, basically you take the nominal GDP and divide it by a price index called the GDP price deflator. That deflator captures the average change in prices for all the components of GDP between the current period and that base year.
Okay. And if there's a big gap between nominal and real GDP growth rates,
that's a strong signal. If nominal growth is way higher than real growth, it points to significant inflation. If, less commonly, real growth was higher than nominal, that would signal deflation, falling prices.
Which is why economists, analysts, investors, policymakers, they all zero in on real GDP growth when they talk about the economy's health and direction.
Absolutely. It's the closest measure we have to tracking changes in actual production output.
Okay, moving beyond just the overall number, let's talk about GDP per capita. This sounds pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
Total GDP divided by the population.
That's exactly it. Total GDP divided by the number of people in the country.
And what does this tell us?
Well, it gives you an indication of the average economic output or income per person. It's widely used as a proxy for average productivity and often kind of as a rough measure of average living standards or the national wealth available per citizen.
Can it be nominal or real too?
Yep. Like total GDP, you can look at it in nominal terms, real terms, or even using purchasing power parity, which we'll get to.
And economists use this to compare countries or track progress.
Both. They look at GDP per capita to gauge how productive their own country is on a per-person basis. And importantly, yes, to compare average living standards with other nations. But our sources do caution you need to be a bit careful interpreting high per capita figures.
Why is that?
Well, a high GDP per capita could mean genuinely high productivity and tech advancement across the whole population. That's good.
Right.
But it could also just be skewed upwards because a country has a relatively small population, but a high total GDP may be due to like oil wealth or some unique industry.
Okay. Like a small country with lots of oil might look rich per person.
Exactly. And crucially, it's an average. A high average GDP per capita tells you absolutely nothing about how that wealth is distributed.
Right. Huge inequality could hide behind a high average.
Precisely. You could have a nation with a really high average but massive income inequality, meaning the vast majority of citizens don't actually experience anywhere near that high level of average wealth or output. It masks the distribution.
Good point. Okay, another metric we hear constantly in the news, the GDP growth rate.
Yes, the growth rate. This is simply the percentage change in GDP from one period to the next.
Like quarter over quarter or year over year.
Both. Typically, you'll see it reported as the change from the previous quarter, often stated as an annualized rate, or compared to the same quarter in the previous year. It's basically the economy's speedometer.
And this is the number policymakers, especially central banks like the Fed, are watching like hawks.
Absolutely. They watch this intently. If the GDP growth rate is accelerating, looking really robust, that might signal the economy is expanding quickly. Maybe even overheating, which could lead to inflation.
So the Fed might raise interest rates.
They might consider tightening monetary policy, yes, raising rates to cool things down a bit, try to head off inflation, getting out of control.
And the opposite, if growth is weak.
Conversely, if the growth rate is slowing down, stagnating, or worst case, shrinking, showing negative growth, that's a clear sign of economic weakness, maybe even a recession.
Then they might cut rates.
In that scenario, policymakers would likely consider expansionary measures, cutting interest rates, maybe fiscal stimulus, to try and boost activity and prevent a deeper downturn.
Our sources gave a specific example for the U.S. recently.
Yeah, they noted U.S. GDP increased at an annual rate of 3.1% in the third quarter of 2024 and 3.0% in the second quarter. Those are exactly the kinds of figures the Fed would be factoring heavily into their interest rate decisions at the time.
Right. Real numbers influencing real policy. Okay, finally, let's touch on GDP purchasing power parity, or PPP. This sounds a bit different. It's not a type of GDP, but a way to compare.
Exactly. It's not a distinct calculation like nominal or real, but it's a method used mainly for making better cross-country comparisons of real output, income, and especially living standards.
Why is that needed? Can't we just compare GDP per capita using exchange rates?
Well, you can, but it can be really misleading. The cost of living varies enormously from country to country, right?
Sure. A dollar buys more in some places than others.
Massively more sometimes. So simply converting, say, China's GDP per capita in yuan to dollars using the market exchange rate and comparing it to Ireland's GDP per capita in euros converted to dollars doesn't really tell you accurately who's better off in terms of what they can actually buy.
The source used that Ireland versus China example, right? Ireland looks way higher nominally.
Yeah, nominally, Ireland's per capita GDP would be significantly higher based on exchange rates. But that doesn't automatically mean the average person in Ireland is proportionally that much better off in terms of the actual goods and services they can afford day to day compared to someone in China.
Thus, PPP tries to fix that.
It attempts to adjust for these differences in local prices and costs of living. It uses something called international dollars.
International dollars.
Yeah, it's a hypothetical currency. PPP calculates how much stuff, goods and services, an exchange rate adjusted unit of money, can actually buy in different countries. It tries to create a hypothetical exchange rate that would make the purchasing power of different currencies equal.
So if a basket of goods costs $100 in the U.S. and 700 yuan in China,
then the PTP exchange rate would be 7 yuan per dollar, even if the market exchange rate is, say, 6.5 or 7.5. Using that PPP rate to compare incomes gives a much more accurate picture of real purchasing power and living standards across borders.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense for comparisons.
Yeah.
So we've got the definition, the C plus I plus G plus NX components, how the BEA measures it, these different flavors: nominal, real, per capita, growth rate, and PPP adjustments. What's fascinating now is, how is all this data actually used? Who's looking at these numbers, and what decisions do they make based on them?
Well, first and foremost, as we touched on, policymakers lean really heavily on GDP data.
The Fed, for instance.
Absolutely. The U.S. Federal Reserve uses the GDP growth rate, along with other related stats like inflation measures, unemployment, to guide its monetary policy decisions. You know, whether to raise, lower, or hold interest rates steady.
Because of their dual mandate.
Yeah.
Jobs and prices.
Exactly. Maximum employment and stable prices. GDP growth is a key indicator for judging how close they are to those goals and whether the economy needs a nudge or maybe needs to be reined in a bit.
So strong GDP growth, but maybe rising inflation. Tighten policy.
Potentially, yes. Raise rates to cool demand.
Weak growth, maybe signs of recession.
Loosen policy. Cut rates to stimulate borrowing and spending. It's a core input into decisions that affect borrowing costs for basically everyone, businesses and individuals.
And businesses themselves use GDP figures too, right, for planning?
Oh, absolutely. GDP numbers give them that high-level overview of the economy's health and, importantly, its growth prospects.
So if a company's thinking about a big expansion,
yeah, like building a new factory or launching a major new product line, they'll definitely look at GDP trends. If growth is projected to be strong, that might encourage them to go ahead with the investment.
and if things look slow.
If there are signs of a slowdown or recession, they'd likely become much more cautious. Maybe scale back plans, hold off on big spending. It guides their strategic thinking.
And investors, they must be glued to these GDP reports.
Oh, completely. For investors, GDP provides a fundamental framework for evaluating the overall market environment and even specific sectors.
Is there useful detail within the reports?
Definitely. The detailed BEA reports contain valuable subcomponents. Data on corporate profits, for instance, that's critical for equity investors assessing company performance and valuations. Inventory data, as we mentioned, can signal future production plans and shifts in consumer demand.
And for global investors.
Comparing GDP growth rates and the economic trajectories of different countries is standard practice. It helps them decide where to allocate assets, which economies abroad might offer better growth opportunities.
Our sources also mentioned a specific ratio investors sometimes look at: market capitalization to GDP.
Right, the market cap to GDP ratio. This compares the total value of all the publicly traded stocks in a country's market to that country's overall GDP.
That's interesting. So it's like comparing the stock market's total value to the actual economic output of the nation.
Exactly. It's often seen as a kind of broad, maybe rough, indicator of whether a country's stock market might be overvalued or undervalued relative to the size of its underlying economy.
Did the sources give examples?
Yeah, some striking ones. For 2022, the U.S. ratio was about 156.5%. China was much lower, around 64.1%. And then Hong Kong was extraordinarily high, something like 1,273.2%.
Whoa, over 12 times its GDP. How is that even possible in Hong Kong?
Well, Hong Kong is a bit of a special case, isn't it? It's a major global financial hub. Many companies, especially from mainland China, but also elsewhere, list their shares there, even if their main economic activity isn't happening within Hong Kong's borders.
Ah, okay. That makes sense. It inflates the market cap relative to the local GDP.
Precisely. So it highlights one of the complexities. But the real utility of the ratio, as our sources emphasize, often comes from comparing it to a nation's own historical average.
Like looking at the U.S. ratio over time.
Exactly. They use the U.S. as an example. At the end of 2006, before the financial crisis really hit, the ratio was about 141.6%. Then, by the end of 2008, after the crash, it had plummeted to around 78.5%.
Ah, okay. So looking back, that high 2006 number might have signaled potential overvaluation, and the low 2008 number, potential undervaluation, relative to history.
That's the idea. It provides some historical context for assessing whether current market levels seem stretched or depressed relative to the economy's overall scale.
Okay, so GDP is clearly powerful, it's widely used, it influences huge decisions. But man, it gets criticized a lot too. Despite all that, what are its main weaknesses? Why isn't it the perfect measure?
Yeah, despite its widespread use and undeniable utility for certain things, GDP has some really significant drawbacks and limitations, especially when people try to use it as the sole measure of a nation's economic success or, even broader, the well-being of its people.
Right.
Our sources outlined several key criticisms that are just vital to understand if you want the full picture.
Okay, let's start with the stuff it just plain misses. What doesn't get counted?
Well, a major one is that it ignores a vast amount of economic activity that doesn't involve a formal market transaction.
Like the underground economy.
Yeah, the informal economy, under-the-table work, black markets, sure. But it also excludes incredibly valuable non-market activities, things like unpaid volunteer work, the value of leisure time, how much is your free time worth, and household production.
Household production, like
cooking meals for your family, cleaning your own home, caring for children or elderly relatives yourself instead of paying someone.
Wow, that's actually huge. The economic value of unpaid childcare or elder care is enormous, right? But because no money changes hands in the formal market,
it doesn't show up in GDP. Not a dime. And think about leisure time. For many people, that's crucial to their quality of life. But GDP doesn't account for it at all.
So you could have two countries with the same GDP.
Right, but if in one country people are working, say, 60 hours a week on average, and in the other it's 40 hours, the country with more leisure might arguably have higher overall well-being, but the GDP number wouldn't show any difference.
Okay, another limitation mentioned, especially relevant today, it's purely geographic focus in a globalized world.
Yes, this is a big one. GDP measures what's produced within the borders, period. But think about profits earned by foreign-owned companies operating inside those borders.
Okay.
Those profits count toward the host country's GDP, even if they're immediately sent back overseas to the foreign investors or parent company.
So it can overstate the actual income or wealth that's generated for the people living in that host country.
Yeah, exactly. It can significantly overstate it sometimes. The Ireland example our sources cited, comparing its GDP to its gross national income, or GNI, really highlights this distortion, especially when multinational corporations route massive profits through countries like Ireland, largely for tax reasons.
So a country like Ireland might look incredibly productive based on its GDP number.
Right, very high GDP.
But if a huge chunk of the profits generated from that activity isn't actually staying in Ireland, the real benefit to Irish citizens isn't nearly as high as that headline GDP figure suggests.
Precisely. And the sources even quoted an IMF paper that tried to quantify this. Finding something like $12 trillion in global foreign direct investment is, quote, completely artificial.
12 trillion. Artificial.
Yeah, basically just financial flows sloshing through empty corporate shells set up in tax havens. It inflates the GDP numbers in those locations. Places like Bermuda, the Cayman Islands, Ireland, Luxembourg, Singapore were mentioned, without generating much, if any, real economic activity or jobs there. It's accounting that boosts GDP, not necessarily real production for the locals.
Wow. Okay, now here's maybe the biggest, most profound criticism, the one that really challenges how we think about progress. GDP focuses on material output, but doesn't measure overall well-being.
This is absolutely critical. GDP growth by itself tells you nothing about the health of a nation's citizens, their education levels, their happiness, the fairness or equality of their society. Nothing.
So a country could boost its GDP by doing things that actually harm well-being.
Absolutely. You could achieve high GDP growth by, say, rapidly cutting down all your forests, polluting your rivers, depleting your natural resources. Those activities might show up as positive GDP in the short term.
Or working people to the bone, increasing inequality.
Exactly. You could have rising GDP alongside declining public health outcomes, a worsening environment, or soaring income inequality where only a tiny fraction of the population benefits.
So there's a difference between just economic output and actual social progress.
A fundamental distinction. High GDP can easily coexist with low GDP per capita if the population is huge. Or it can coexist with wealth being concentrated in very, very few hands, making that average figure pretty meaningless for most people's lived reality.
Which is why some sources suggest looking at other measures alongside GDP.
Right. Measures like the Human Development Index, the HDI, it includes health and education metrics alongside income. Looking at GDP and HDI gives a much more rounded, complete picture of a nation's actual development and the quality of life for its people.
Okay. Another point raised in the criticisms was that GDP ignores intermediate business-to-business, B2B activity.
Right. Remember, the expenditure approach, C plus I plus G plus NX, focuses only on the final goods and services sold to the end user, plus new capital investment. It deliberately nets out the value of goods and services sold between businesses as intermediate inputs along the production chain.
But why is that a criticism? Isn't that necessary to avoid double counting?
It is necessary to avoid double counting final output value, yes. But the criticism is that by focusing only on the final stage, GDP overstates the relative importance of consumer spending, the C, in driving the entire economy, compared to the whole complex chain of production and all the B2B transactions that make that final output possible.
Ah, okay. It makes consumption look bigger relative to production.
Kind of, yeah. And some argue it also makes GDP potentially less sensitive to fluctuations happening earlier in the production process compared to measures that do capture B2B activity.
Interesting. Okay, and this last major criticism from the sources is really quite startling, almost counterintuitive. GDP counts costs, waste, and even destructive activities as positive contributions.
Yeah, this is a powerful point. It really exposes GDP's limitations as a measure of genuine value or progress. GDP simply adds up spending, C plus I plus G plus NX. It doesn't ask why the money was spent or whether the spending was actually beneficial.
So it doesn't distinguish between good spending and bad spending?
Not at all. It treats all final private and government spending as additions to income and output. It doesn't distinguish between spending that creates lasting value, spending that's just offsetting some negative outcome, or spending that's arguably wasteful or even destructive from a societal perspective.
Give me some examples, like if there's a natural disaster.
Right. If there's a hurricane or an oil spill, the money spent on cleanup and rebuilding afterwards adds to GDP.
Even though the disaster itself caused immense destruction.
Exactly. If a country builds, say, ghost cities or bridges to nowhere, that construction spending boosts GDP. If crime rates go up, the money spent on more police, more prisons, more security systems, that all adds to GDP too.
So things we might see as negatives actually push the number up.
Precisely. The sources list examples like the administrative costs of collecting taxes, money spent on lobbying politicians, rent-seeking activities where people try to capture existing wealth rather than create new wealth, even weapons production. These activities consume resources, involve final expenditures, and therefore increase GDP.
Even if their societal value is zero, or negative, or just a necessary cost to deal with problems.
Correct. GDP is measuring the activity, the churn of money, and production in the market economy. It's not measuring efficiency or benefit or genuine wealth creation or well-being.
That really hammers home the point. GDP measures economic size or activity, but it's definitely not a perfect measure of progress or well-being.
Absolutely. It's a tool designed for a specific purpose, measuring market output. It was never designed, nor is it capable of, measuring the full, complex picture of human welfare or national success.
Okay, given all those nuances, those criticisms,
Yeah.
so let's take a deeper dive now into one specific area where the relationship with GDP is really heavily debated, and that's the impact of government spending on economic growth. This is a constant battleground in policy discussions, isn't it?
It truly is. And the core question dividing policymakers, economists, everyone really, is fundamental. Does expanding the size and scope of government activity and therefore government spending ultimately help or hinder a nation's economic growth and prosperity?
Your strong arguments on both sides. On the bigger government help side, what are the main points?
Well, those who argue for a larger government role often emphasize its importance in providing essential public goods and services.
Yep.
Things the private sector might not provide enough of on its own because, well, it's hard to charge for them or exclude non-payers.
Like national defense, clean air, basic research.
Exactly. National defense, clean air and water, basic scientific research, education, large-scale infrastructure like highways, the power grid. They argue government needs to provide these. And then there's the Keynesian view.
Right, stimulating the economy.
Yeah, the idea that government spending, especially during economic downturns, can stimulate demand, boost employment, help stabilize the whole business cycle, injecting money when private spending pulls back. That classic pump priming argument.
Okay. And then you have the arguments for a smaller government. These seem to align more with some of those GDP criticisms we just talked about.
Yes, there's definitely overlap. Those advocating for smaller government generally argue that government allocates resources less efficiently than the private sector does.
Why?
Because private sector decisions are driven primarily by market signals, prices, consumer demand, profit motives. Government decisions are often driven more by political forces, bureaucracy, lobbying, which they argue leads to less efficient outcomes.
So bigger government means more resources pulled from the efficient private sector.
That's the core argument. When government spending grows, it has to transfer resources, labor, capital, land from the more productive, market-driven private sector to the arguably less efficient, politically driven public sector. They also contend that a large public sector just adds complexity, makes it harder to implement pro-growth policies flexibly.
And how it's paid for is also a problem.
Right. They argue higher government spending is inevitably linked to either higher taxes or more government borrowing, or maybe inflation. And they see all of those financing methods as having negative consequences for long-term economic growth.
Our sources actually dig into several specific theoretical costs of government spending. Not just waste, but inherent economic effects, even for necessary spending.
Exactly. They break down these potential costs. First, there's the extraction cost. Government spending isn't free, it has to be financed.
Taxes, borrowing, or printing money.
Right. And each method takes resources out of the private sector and imposes costs. Taxes can discourage work, saving, investment. Government borrowing competes with private borrowing for capital, potentially pushing up interest rates. That's the crowding out idea. And printing money leads to inflation, which erodes purchasing power and creates uncertainty. So just the act of financing government has a cost.
Okay, extraction costs, then the displacement costs.
This is pretty straightforward. Every dollar, every resource the government uses is one that's not being used by individuals or businesses in the private sector.
Opportunity costs.
Exactly. And the argument is, since the private sector is generally assumed to be more responsive to market signals and better at allocating resources to where they're most valued, based on consumer wants, profit potential, this displacement leads to a less efficient overall use of the nation's resources and potentially lower output than you'd otherwise get.
They even mentioned a negative multiplier cost. That sounds ominous.
Yeah, this is about government spending that actually finances activities that harm economic activity or create significant negative side effects.
Like what?
The sources give examples like funding regulatory agencies whose rules impose really heavy costs on businesses, maybe stifling innovation, or perhaps funding international organizations that advocate for policies seen as detrimental to growth. The idea is the direct government spending might seem small, but the downstream economic damage caused by the activities being funded could be much larger, creating a negative overall effect.
Okay. And then there were behavioral costs, split into two types.
Right. First, behavioral subsidy costs. These are programs that unintentionally subsidize or encourage economically undesirable decisions.
Undesirable how?
Well, the classic examples given are things like welfare programs that might, at the margin, disincentivize work by making leisure relatively more attractive financially. Or unemployment benefits that, if too generous or long-lasting, could potentially extend joblessness beyond what's needed for a good match. Or government flood insurance that encourages people to build homes in risky floodplains where it's economically inefficient to build.
Okay, subsidizing bad choices. What's the other side?
Behavioral penalty costs. These are programs that might discourage economically desirable decisions.
Like saving money.
Potentially, yeah. Think about generous government subsidies for retirement, housing, or higher education. Does that reduce the personal incentive for individuals to save and invest wisely for those things themselves? Another example given was Medicaid eligibility rules that might incentivize people near the cutoff to artificially reduce their income or shuffle assets around to qualify, rather than maximizing their earnings potential.
That's a really interesting way to frame the unintended consequences, even of programs designed to help. What about market distortion costs?
Government spending can definitely distort how competitive markets work. Subsidies to specific industries give them an advantage, maybe leading to overinvestment there, creating an uneven playing field.
Like farm subsidies.
That's a common example, yeah. Also, think about third-party payer systems, which are really common in government-funded or heavily subsidized areas like healthcare and higher education.
Where the person using the service isn't directly paying the full cost.
Exactly. When the consumer isn't very sensitive to the price because insurance or the government is paying most of it, it can lead to inefficient overconsumption of the service or allow prices to escalate much faster than they otherwise would.
Right.
And another distortion. The mere existence of government contracts, subsidies, and favors encourages individuals and companies to spend resources lobbying for those goodies that's rent-seeking, instead of spending those resources on actually producing valuable goods and services.
Okay. And the last two costs were inefficiency and stagnation.
Right. Inefficiency cost is the basic argument that government, often being a large centralized bureaucracy without direct market competition, is just inherently less efficient at providing certain services, maybe education, running airports, delivering mail, compared to how competitive private sector companies could potentially do it, perhaps with higher quality or lower cost.
Because they lack the profit motive or competitive pressure?
That's the argument, and related to that is the stagnation cost. The idea here is that the inherent nature of government programs, often centralized, bureaucratic, slow to change, can inhibit innovation and the dynamic process of creative destruction, where new ideas and businesses replace old ones. That process is seen as vital for long-term growth in market economies, and big government might slow it down.
So the overall argument seems to be that government spending, even if the goal is good, carries these inherent economic costs, at the very least, extraction and displacement. And the net effect on the economy depends on whether the benefits of any specific program actually outweigh all these combined costs.
That's the framework presented, yes. And it leads into that broader debate about budget deficits versus just the sheer size of government, which our sources also tackled.
Right, because you have the Keynesian view focusing on deficits.
Exactly. The Keynesian perspective tends to view government deficits mainly as a tool for short-term demand management, especially crucial during recessions. They advocate for temporary increases in government spending, financed by borrowing, creating a deficit, to boost aggregate demand and employment when the private sector is weak. That pump priming.
But they don't necessarily want permanently bigger government?
Not necessarily from that perspective alone. The focus is on the deficit as a temporary stimulus measure to stabilize the business cycle. It's about timing and countercyclical policy.
Okay. And then you have the deficit hawks.
Right. The deficit hawks are primarily worried about the long-term consequences of government borrowing. Their main argument is that persistent deficits lead to a growing national debt.
Which is bad because
they argue, it can crowd out private investment. The government borrowing more increases the demand for loanable funds, which can push up interest rates, making it more expensive for businesses to borrow and invest. So their priority is deficit reduction, even if that means keeping government large but financing it with higher taxes instead of borrowing.
So Keynesians. Deficit's okay for short-term stimulus. Deficit hawks. Deficit's bad long-term due to interest rates. But our sources seem to make a different, maybe more fundamental point.
They did. They argue that the primary economic issue isn't really how government spending is financed, whether it's through taxes today or borrowing, which implies future taxes or inflation. They see both taxes and deficits as harmful ways to extract resources from the private sector.
Taxes have direct costs and disincentives. Borrowing consumes capital.
Exactly. The fundamental problem in this view isn't the financing method per se, but the sheer size of government relative to the economy. The scale of resources being allocated by political decisions rather than market forces, that's what leads to all those costs we just discussed: extraction, displacement, inefficiency, distortion, etc.
So the argument is, focus on reducing the size of government spending itself. If you do that, the deficit problem tends to take care of itself, and you unleash more economic growth because you're reducing those inherent costs.
That's the core argument presented. Reduce the burden of government, and both the budget and the economy improve. What evidence do the sources offer to back up this idea that bigger government correlates with weaker economic performance?
They point to a couple of things, comparing international experiences and looking at academic research. A key comparison was between the U.S. and the older EU countries, the EU 15.
Right, the members before the big 2004 expansion.
And the data they cited showed a really noticeable difference in government size back then, right? The EU 15 governments were consuming, on average, around 50% of their GDP.
Yeah, much larger than the U.S. at the time.
Yes, the U.S. government spending was around 35–36% of GDP in the 2003 data they used.
And according to the source, this significant difference in government size correlated pretty strongly with different economic outcomes during that period.
How so?
The U.S. generally had substantially higher per capita output, meaning a higher average income. It had significantly faster real economic growth over the previous decade, much lower overall unemployment rates, and a vastly lower rate of long-term unemployment compared to the EU 15 average.
They even made a striking comparison about living standards.
Yeah, the source went so far as to say that living standards in the EU back then were roughly equivalent to those in the poorest U.S. states, despite the EU having generally more generous social safety nets.
Wow. That comparison really makes you stop and think. Now they acknowledge other factors are involved.
Oh, absolutely. Things like differing labor market regulations, tax burdens, which were also generally higher in the EU 15, those play a role too. But the correlation between the sheer size of government and these economic performance indicators is highlighted as compelling evidence by the source.
Suggesting that maybe, beyond a certain point, the costs associated with very large government start to outweigh the benefits, acting as a drag on economic dynamism and overall prosperity.
That's the implication drawn. And this isn't just based on that one comparison. The sources also claim this finding is supported by a body of academic research.
Yes, they state that a review of numerous academic studies using different methods and data sets over time indicates a kind of growing consensus that, generally speaking, higher levels of government spending tend to be associated with weaker economic performance, slower growth.
Okay. Did they mention any specific findings from these studies?
Yeah, quite a few. Things like budget consolidation achieved through spending cuts seems to be better for economic output than consolidation achieved through tax increases. The idea that taxes impose an excess burden beyond just the revenue they collect, evidence that government spending can crowd out private spending, and findings suggesting that growth in the size of government can actually stunt job growth.
So it's not just theory, there's empirical work suggesting these effects. Did any studies try to quantify it? Like, how much does growth slow down?
Yes, some did attempt that. Findings were cited suggesting, for example, that a 10 percentage point increase in the ratio of government spending to GDP is associated with an annual growth rate that's maybe 0.7 to 0.8 percentage points lower.
Wow, that's significant over time.
Yeah, another estimate mentioned was that a 1% increase in government size might decrease the growth rate by about 0.143%. These might sound like small numbers, but compounded year after year, they can lead to huge differences in living standards over decades.
Absolutely. Okay, so given this theoretical framework arguing costs of government spending and the empirical evidence presented suggesting a negative correlation with growth at higher levels, are there examples of countries that have actually done it, successfully reduced the size of government, and seen positive economic results? The source seemed to argue it is possible, despite political difficulties.
Yes, the sources definitely present several case studies to argue exactly that. Starting right here in the United States, they point to the administrations of Ronald Reagan and, maybe more surprisingly to some, Bill Clinton.
Reagan, okay. Known for tax cuts, but also spending control.
According to the source, yes. His administration had the lowest real federal spending growth rate among post-WWII presidents up to that point. He managed to reduce total federal spending as a percentage of GDP and also entitlement spending as a share of GDP, even while significantly increasing defense spending during the Cold War.
Interesting. And Bill Clinton, usually thought of differently.
Well, the source credits him with the second most fiscally restrained record post-WWII, especially in his first term. Under Clinton, domestic discretionary spending and entitlement spending both fell as a percentage of GDP. And total federal spending actually hit its lowest level as a share of GDP since 1966 by the year 2000.
Uh-huh.
Now, the source does add caveats the influence of the Republican Congress during part of that time, some later reversals in spending trends, but it highlights that significant government downsizing relative to the economy did happen under both presidents.
Okay. What about examples from other countries? Ireland was mentioned as a dramatic turnaround.
Yes, Ireland's story is presented as quite remarkable. Back in the 1980s, it was often called the sick man of Europe, struggling with high unemployment, stagnation, and government spending was over 50% of GDP.
Wow, over half the economy.
Yeah. But then they significantly reduced government spending, got it down below 40% of GDP by 1996. Combine that with tax cuts, deregulation, and Ireland transformed into the Celtic Tiger. Experienced really rapid economic growth, lots of job creation. The source points to that spending reduction as a key driver of the turnaround.
Okay, that's a compelling case. New Zealand, too.
New Zealand is another example cited for making similarly bold reforms. They also slashed government spending from over 50% down to below 40% of GDP, dramatically cut the number of government employees, implemented a range of other free market policies, and this helped lift the country out of stagnation in the early 90s. Real spending per person actually fell significantly during that reform period.
So real cuts, not just slowing growth.
Yes. And the source also included a chart showing Slovakia making a substantial decrease in government spending as a share of GDP over several years, implying that was another case of fiscal consolidation and smaller government leading to better economic prospects.
Okay. So the conclusion drawn from these examples in the source material is
that reducing the size of government relative to the economy is not only politically possible, despite the challenges, but it's also consistently associated with better economic performance, faster growth, more jobs.
And that this is the best way to handle deficits?
Yes, the sources argue it's the most effective pro-growth way to deal with government deficits. They even suggest that just modest, sustained spending discipline can balance a budget relatively quickly, mainly by allowing economic growth to raise revenues faster than spending grows.
They had projections on that.
Yeah, they showed projections suggesting that even something like a simple spending freeze could potentially balance the U.S. budget in just a few years based on historical growth rates, or even just limiting spending growth to the rate of inflation could do it within maybe 4 or 5 years.
So the argument is the spending cuts needed aren't necessarily draconian, and the economic benefits from that discipline could be really substantial.
That's the case being made by the source material, yes. However, it's also really crucial to remember, and the source does acknowledge this, that the size of government spending isn't the only thing that matters for economic growth. It's a big piece, according to them, but not the whole puzzle.
Right. You need to look at other policy areas, too, like tax policy.
Absolutely. And not just the total tax burden, but the structure of the tax system. How does it affect incentives? Things like high marginal tax rates on work or investment are often argued to discourage economic activity, whereas flatter, simpler systems might encourage it.
Monetary policy is obviously critical, too.
Definitely. A stable monetary system, one that preserves the value of the currency, keeps inflation low and predictable. That's essential for businesses and individuals to make long-term plans and investments. High or volatile inflation can just cripple an economy.
Trade policy was mentioned as well. Openness versus protectionism.
Right. Being open to international trade allows countries to specialize in what they do best, increases competition, drives efficiency, and generally leads to higher living standards. Protectionism, on the other hand, usually imposes costs on consumers and reduces overall efficiency.
And regulation.
Regulatory policy is another key lever. Excessive, poorly designed, or outdated regulations can create huge costs for businesses, stifle innovation, misallocate resources, while smart deregulation or regulatory reform can improve efficiency and dynamism.
And maybe most fundamental of all, property rights.
Yeah, secure private property rights seem essential. If individuals and businesses aren't confident that they can actually own and benefit from the fruits of their labor, their ideas, their investments, or if they fear the government might arbitrarily seize their assets or control resources, it just undermines all the incentives needed for a vibrant market economy. Weak property rights mean political connections can matter more than economic efficiency.
The sources also briefly touched on other factors, right? Like corruption, the health of the financial system.
Yeah, corruption. the openness and competitiveness of capital markets, having a stable and well-functioning financial system, flexibility in prices and wages. All these things contribute to the overall economic environment. So while the size and scope of government spending is presented as a major factor, it clearly operates within this much broader ecosystem of policies and institutions that collectively shape how well an economy performs.
Okay, so let's try to pull all of this together. Let's bring it back to you, our listener. Why does understanding all this stuff about gross domestic product, its different forms, its limitations, these big debates around it, why does it actually matter in your day-to-day life?
Well, firstly, just practically, GDP is the single most common, most widely reported measure of economic activity you're going to encounter, period.
It's everywhere.
It is. So understanding its basic definition, what those C plus I plus G plus NX components are, who compiles it, that's just foundational for making sense of the economic news headlines you see every day, and understanding the constant discussions about whether the economy is doing well or poorly.
And knowing the difference between nominal GDP, real GDP, and GDP per capita is really crucial, isn't it?
Absolutely critical. It lets you look past that potentially flashy top-line number and ask, okay, what's really driving the change? Is it just prices going up, nominal, or are we actually producing more stuff, real? And how does that translate to income or output on a per-person basis per capita? It helps you cut through potentially misleading statistics and noise.
And knowing how major players, the Fed, businesses, investors actually use this GDP data, that provides essential context, right? It helps you understand the decisions that end up impacting everything from the interest rate on your mortgage or credit card to the conditions in the job market, maybe even the performance of your retirement savings. These GDP numbers guide actions that directly affect your financial life.
And maybe the most important takeaway, really, is being acutely aware of GDP's criticisms and limitations. That is just vital for a balanced, nuanced understanding.
Yeah, don't take it as gospel.
Exactly. GDP is a powerful tool for measuring market activity, yes. But it is not a measure of everything that matters.
Yeah.
It doesn't capture the value of unpaid work at home, the health of our environment, the level of inequality in society, or overall happiness and well-being. Recognizing its blind spots stops you from making the mistake of equating GDP growth with genuine human progress. They aren't always the same thing.
And finally, understanding the debate we just explored, the evidence presented about the impact of government spending on GDP growth that equips you to critically evaluate the economic policy arguments you hear constantly from politicians, commentators, everyone.
Right.
It shows that the relationship between the size of the state and the vitality of the economy is complex, it's hotly debated, and it has really significant real-world implications. It helps you think more deeply about how an economy actually grows and what kinds of policies might genuinely foster long-term prosperity beyond just trying to influence short-term economic activity numbers.
Okay, so to wrap up this deep dive then, we've really journeyed from the fundamental definition of GDP, its core components, C plus I plus G plus NX, explored the different ways it's reported, nominal, real, per capita, growth rate. PPP touched on its history, examined its widespread uses by policymakers and investors.
And critically delved into its significant limitations as a comprehensive measure of progress, what it misses, how it can be distorted.
Exactly. And then we took that focused look at the really contentious debate about the impact of government spending on economic growth, considering those theoretical costs associated with government activity, and reviewing the empirical evidence presented from different countries and academic studies suggesting potential downsides to larger government.
You know, the economists Samuelson and Nordhaus had a good analogy. They described GDP as being like a satellite view of the economic weather across an entire continent. It gives you that high-level picture.
Yeah.
It helps policymakers and observers gauge the big trends. Is the economy expanding rapidly? Is it stagnating? Is it contracting? And it helps spot potential threats on the horizon, like a looming recession or rising inflation. It serves that purpose.
But, and this is the big but we keep coming back to,
Yeah.
as we've seen throughout this discussion, it is an inherently imperfect tool, especially for measuring true economic reality and, even more so, societal well-being.
Right. It misses vast amounts of valuable non-market activity. It gets distorted geographically in our globalized economy. It emphasizes material output, potentially at the expense of well-being or the environment.
And perhaps most strikingly, as you pointed out, it counts costs, waste, and even destructive activities as positive contributions to its bottom line. Disaster cleanup boosts GDP. Security spending boosts GDP.
Yeah. And the whole debate around government's role really underscores that how an economy functions, how it grows, how well it serves its people, It's influenced by this complex interplay of many factors. GDP measures the scale of market output, sure, but it doesn't give you the full picture of an economy's efficiency, its sustainability, or the actual well-being it fosters for its citizens.
So, based on everything we've unpacked today, all these strengths and weaknesses, here's a final provocative thought for you, our listener, to maybe ponder on your own. If GDP, with all its known limitations, is still our primary report card for the economy, and we know it fails to capture crucial things like unpaid work, environmental health, inequality, human happiness, and it even counts things like disaster recovery or military spending as positive growth. What would your ideal report card for a nation's progress look like? If you were designing it, what key indicators, beyond just market output measured by GDP, would you want to see measured and reported on regularly to get a truly comprehensive picture of how a country and its people are really doing?
Yeah. What else belongs on that report card? Something to definitely think about next time you see those GDP headlines flash across your screen.
Indeed. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the complex world of gross domestic product. We really hope it gives you a much sharper lens through which to view the economy's report card from now on.
Absolutely. We'll catch you on the next one.